Then in a few minutes, when there's enough people, I will sort of start talking and we take it from there. And also to let you know that we will, as a group, stay on after the webinar is done. And we'll just have to kind of mute ourselves and wait for people to leave, because there's no way for us to end for only the participants. So if you would like to also stay on and just have a little debrief chat afterwards, we'd be really happy about that. And if not, then of course, I know you're really busy, so it's up to you. Okay. I'll mute myself now and I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the political economy of climate in action. I think now is a good time to start. I see that we have already over 40 people in the room and the numbers are climbing up. My name is Christiane and I am part of the Decarb Future Economy Forum. I will be guiding you through the next 1.5 hours this afternoon. For those who don't know the Decarb Future Economy Forum, we invite expert guests and then we ask them the question, how can we decarbonize our economy? Some of you have already previously attended our events when we approached this question through different topics. For example, green growth, degrowth, green fiscal and monetary policy, green finance, innovation policies, or a European Green Deal. And I actually encourage you to go onto our website where you can find summaries and recordings of some of these really interesting sessions that we had. But today is a little different because today we're actually taking a step back and asking our guests why we are not seeing the progress that we would like to see when it comes to stopping climate change. It's pretty clear right now what some of the things are that need to be done to happen to fight climate change, such as stop exploiting fossil fuels. But then it seems like the world is stuck in a bit of a rut in business as usual. So we have invited 3 experts today to showcase some of their research and work on why the progress is so slow and what would have to change. To discuss this important topic, we are grateful to have a really stellar panel. We have Dr. Gregor Semieniuk, we have Katie Kedward, and we have Daniel Mittler. A big and warm welcome to the 3 of you. All of our speakers have really interesting backgrounds in their respective fields, and I will introduce them in more detail before their talks. Each of them will give a short presentation with their key messages, and then at the end we should have a good half hour or so for questions from the audience. Because this is a webinar, you will find that as participants you're muted and your video is off. So if you have a question, please make sure to use the Q&A function. You can also comment on others' questions or upvote them there. And please be advised that the webinar is being recorded as well. Finally, before we begin, I would like to thank our partners who are making Decarb's work possible. Thank you so much to the Center for Sustainability at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin for providing the technical infrastructure. And we also want to thank the Stiftung Deutsche Wirtschaft, who provided seed funding to Decarb for us to create the organization. And a big thank you to our academic partners, the MCC in Berlin, the DIW in Berlin, and the Oxford Smith School. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Gregor Semieniuk. Gregor is joining us from the United States today, where he works as a senior climate change economist at the World Bank. He is currently on leave from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Gregor has a PhD from the New School of Social Research, and he has also previously worked as a lecturer at SOAS. So you can already see from this short biography that he has been through some of the best heterodox economics departments, certainly in the global north. And I'm really interested to hear your perspectives that you're presenting today. Gregor's work focuses on the political economy of rapid policy-induced structural change that is required for decarbonizing the economy. And he looks at different questions within that. So on the one hand, how to finance low carbon sectors, but then also on the other hand, how to achieve divestment from high carbon sectors. And what are the characteristics of stable, equitable growth with climate policy that they go together with these goals. So I look forward to your presentation. Now over to you, Gregor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christiane, for this nice introduction. And I should begin by saying a little disclaimer that what I'm presenting and saying here are my views and not the views of the World Bank or those of its shareholders. And with that said, let me try to share some slides that I've prepared to speak to this topic that you have proposed for today from my point of view and from specifically some recent research that I'm gonna base this on. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see them fine.
Okay, great. So I want to speak about stranded assets in a low carbon transition. Who stands to lose? This talk is based on two papers that were published about a year and a few months back, respectively, and with very lovely and great co-authors. And I also want you to watch this space for more near-term current situation analysis coming up, because this research all looks at kind of a longer horizon and what that means for the value of fossil fuel assets. But you know, kind of assuming a long-term horizon. That's what I'm going to be speaking about today. And here you have some long-term horizon, or what I call that. We have a new World Economic Outlook from the International Energy Agency that tells us that we are really standing in front of divergent futures for fossil fuel production. And I'm going to be speaking about oil and gas only here. Now you can see here a purple scenario that is the IEA's projection for oil and gas demand in 2035 at the global level in exajoules per year. That's the unit of energy that measures what you want from oil and gas energy to do something, such as displacing yourself or heating your homes. And so in the purple scenario, these are, you know, where they are, almost 200 exajoules per year for oil, a little less for gas. For the experts, this is only unabated gas, so there's a little bit of CCS also that's not represented here. And then we have the net zero scenario, which is consistent with achieving the Paris Agreement agreed by countries around the world. And you can see that these are really divergent pictures of the world 12 years from now, right? And if you are an oil company today, you have to decide which future you think we'll be finding ourselves in, because you have to make investment decisions today for major capital assets that are still going to be around, certainly in 12 years, if not in 30 years. So it's a huge situation of uncertainty, really. And of course, we could also be anywhere in between here, right? So it's difficult to look ahead. Now, what do oil companies do? Well, they're actually betting on a high fossil fuel future at the moment. So here on the left-hand side, this is from the website of the largest international oil company that is investing to grow energy supply, and by that they mean mainly oil and gas supply. On the right hand here, this is the Guardian reporting on what they call insanity, reporting on a UN report that discusses production expansion plans in various countries, and that would throw humanity's future into question. So these companies are currently, I guess, kind of looking towards this purple scenario, and so do financial investors. And really, I'm going to be speaking more to these financial investors and their thoughts going forward. So this is a snapshot from US energy index. That means it tracks stock market listed companies listed in the United States that are in the fossil fuel business. And I want you to focus on these figures here, which compare this index with the wider economy index. And you can see that actually over 10 years, the fossil fuel sector hasn't been giving good returns to investors. But over the last 3 years, they have been performing exceptionally well, right? And what that really means is that a lot of people want to buy these stocks, and that pushes up these prices. So, so we're really in a situation where fossil fuel companies and their financial investors are, basically thinking this is a good investment, and that means that they need to give you profits in the future. Because, I mean, we can discuss different definitions of how you value capital stock and assets in the Q&A. But if you're a financial investor, the only reason why you want to value a stock today is because you think it's going to give you returns in the future. In fact, the standard model for valuing assets is a discounted cash flow model, where you look at cash flows in the future, discount them to the present, add them up, and that should be the value of your asset, right? So the research question that I'm going to present briefly on is, what if we end up closer to that green scenario, and this discounted cash flow analysis turns out to have to be revised downward, and all of these asset values are much less than investors thought when they were investing in these stocks. And we call this stranded assets, right? Assets that devalue after the investment decision has been made unexpectedly. And so we're looking at the ultimate owners, so those behind, or the ultimate beneficiaries, those behind these financial system investors and intermediaries, which are persons and governments. And the question is, what does that mean for support for the fossil fuel industry, which, as the webinar says, might be holding up some part of that transition. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, just very briefly. So once you have identified these lost future profits, which we do with our own scenario modeling, we have devised a way to attribute that to individual oil and gas fields, which basically depends on their economics. The more costly gas and oil fields shut down first because they cannot compete anymore in the future with lower demand, vis-a-vis a future with high demand. And that is then translated into losses for oil and gas firms. So they, of course, first experience these stranded assets, and that is then propagated to a network of shareholders and intermediators, notably down here, all of these different types of fund managers. And we're currently working on really making this a lot better, our network. And maybe next time I can speak to that new research. But basically, we're still working on this, but we have a version of this network that allows us to propagate this to ultimate beneficiaries, who could be the people who then have a vested interest in this industry going forward. And we can also look at where they sit, kind of like socioeconomic characteristics of these beneficiaries. All right, now I realize this is a lot, and I can't go through the whole approach here in limited time, but please do check out the papers if you want to know more. So just a few brief results here. So basically, what we can do is we can attribute these total stranded assets, which we, in our preferred scenario, from comparing high and low demand futures, sum to about $1.4 trillion. But we have many different scenarios, and the qualitative results are robust to varying these scenarios. So what you can see is that when you partition these assets at every stage, we had 4 stages that I showed you before, and a 5th one that I'll show you next. You can see that the geographical distribution of these assets shifts from countries of production, which are mainly in the non-OECD part of the world, much more towards OECD countries. And within OECD countries, the ultimate owners are mainly individual persons rather than governments, and perhaps not surprisingly elsewhere, governments take a much larger hit due to state-owned enterprises working on oil and gas. Okay, well, as an example how that looks at an individual country, this is for the United States. The stranded assets attributable to entities in the United States, be it oil and gas fields, headquarters of companies, financial investors, or ultimate beneficiaries, shows you this evolution of stranded assets through the network. And when you look at stage 4 further, you can do that for a lot of countries, and turns out the United States is actually the country with the most stranded assets in our modeling, followed by a few other countries that you'd maybe expect there. And you see Saudi Arabia is down here, and the stranded assets are mainly coming from getting a lower amount of profit per barrel sold, because Saudi Arabia can still sell its oil, which is among the most competitive in the world. All right. Moving on to this last stage, stage 5, how do these assets distribute themselves across parts of the population? What you see here are results for Europe and USA by joining the United States, by joining our results with the World Inequality Lab data on wealth inequality. And what you see here is that the yellow and green parts basically dominate these distributions, and those represent the shares in the ownership of stranded assets, basically ownership of losses among the wealthiest 1% and next 9% of persons in these countries. Whereas the rest of the population, notably the less affluent half, really has hardly any stake in this. One way to put this is, if you own most apples, you also own most rotten apples, right? So this is what we're seeing here, and it's quite similar across countries. And again, we're really excited to show you more research that digs a little bit more detailed into these asset classes, which indicates that perhaps the shares for the upper groups are even larger, because these are pretty rough averages. But anyway, there are some assumptions behind this analysis anyway, and what I want you to notice here are the qualitative results that I think are quite robust to varying some of these assumptions. All right, so let me stop with a few implications.
Just to let you know, we're past the 10-minute mark because you wanted a warning. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. Perfect. Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm also on my last slide here. And, first I want to highlight that because there's so much financial ownership in OECD countries that are, of course, among some of the countries with the most ambitious goals for decarbonization, that is actually an opportunity for taking climate action via via the financial route and company ownership, right? I mean, these company owners ultimately have a say in what companies do. So this could actually be used to influence companies to not do these investments in the first place that are excessive and therefore, have no future role to play in production for a low carbon future. But it's also a risk. There are vested interests. If you own these assets, you need a profit. Otherwise, you're making a loss. That's not why you're there as a financial investor. So clearly, there are groups of people, and in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, where the pension systems are capital market based, that can extend to quite large groups of people that have an interest in directly or indirectly in these assets performing. So one thing we discuss in this Jewel piece at greater length, if you're interested, is that because the shares of these assets are so unequally distributed, it would actually be very cheap for governments to take out the financial downside for the majority of the population. And so, there's relatively affordable scope for policy basically to influence these coalitions that might be for or against a high carbon future, because the policy can influence the financial returns that are associated with these associations with fossil fuels. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gregor. This has been really, really interesting. And I'm so glad that we invited you and that we started with your talk, because I think it really highlighted how structurally embedded these fossil fuel investments are and how they really link to sort of some of the big inequalities that we're also seeing. So on the one hand, I think it's a really bleak picture. On the other hand, I think it's actually a great chance for redistribution, as you said. I have a quick question. We don't have a lot of time before moving to Katie, but can you just say some very high level words on what data sources you used for this?
Yeah, of course. Our main source for financial ownership here is actually the Orbis database, which is maintained by the Bureau van Dijk and is very expensive. So go get a university affiliation where they already have that access if you want to use it. And for the oil and oil field data, we're using the Rystad UCube database, which is kind of industry standard for the oil and gas field economics. And we then also draw on a variety of other databases to understand some of these financial interlinkages better and do a lot of manual search, trying to validate some of the more important links that we find. And I should maybe briefly say, I mean, this research we did kind of with a let's download the whole thing and see where the network is. So we ended up having a network of 1.8 million companies in our ownership network. So that's a very large, and also over 40,000 oil and gas fields and over 3,000 oil and gas companies. So these are really kind of quantitatively large endeavors, and so it's not obvious that you can just look at this and see what's coming out. And I was quite surprised by this large shift from one geography to another. I was expecting some, but I think it's over 15 percentage points of the entire stranded asset volume that's being shifted around the world.
Wow, that is so impressive. It sounds like your servers were working very, very hard during those calculation processes. Thank you so much, Gregor, and to everyone in the audience. Please put your questions for Gregor in the Q&A and we can pick them up later on during the discussion. I will now move on to our next speaker. I'm really pleased to be welcoming Katie Kedward. Hello, Katie, who is joining us today from the UK. Katie is a senior research fellow and a PhD candidate at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where she focuses on sustainable finance. And Katie has quite a varied career in this field with lots of different experience. So her career started in capital markets at the Royal Bank of Canada, where she was a government bond and derivative specialist. And then prior to joining UCL, she has also worked in green banking at the NGO Share Action and as a researcher for George Monbiot. So those with a UK background here in the audience will be familiar with his work on environmental activism. And Katie holds an MSc in ecological economics from the University of Leeds and also a first-class degree from the University of Cambridge. When I was looking through your bio, Katie, today, I saw that you have won lots of different accolades and awards for these different studies. So I'm extra excited to hear about sort of your current research and what you've been keeping busy with. Today, she will be exploring the institutional pressures and politics that explain where we are at the moment. I will hand over to you now, Katie. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Christiane, and for inviting me to speak in this Decarb Forum. I'm very excited to be here to share my research. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, let's put that in presentation mode. Can you see that okay?
Yes, looks great.
Great. Okay, so today I'm presenting some work of a paper that I've written, co-authored with my fantastic and inspiring co-authors Daniela Gabor and Josh Ryan Collins on basically the political economy of green central banking. And our motivation here is as central banks, as these really important policymakers who kind of steward and guide the financial system and also preserve price stability, because over the past 4 years or so, they've really dedicated in varying degrees quite a lot of time and energy to turning to consider climate issues and what that means for their remit. But over the past 4 years, we've also seen quite a lot of divergence and evolution internationally and within institutions on what constitutes the most appropriate role for the central bank in engaging with climate issues. So in the example on this slide, we can see a really stark difference between the ECB's early position on climate, where they position the central bank as a catalyst that should aim to support the European Commission's transition strategy, and that of the US Federal Reserve, on the other hand, who were completely silent for a very long time on climate, but whose position has been emphasised this year by Jerome Powell to be one of caring about climate only from a very kind of narrow financial stability, climate risk perspective only. But what's interesting here is that in recent months, the ECB has rolled back on its previously ambitious stance and has now converged more or less to the position of the Federal Reserve. And this is interesting because the ECB has actually invested significantly institutionally in launching a climate strategy review, developing a fully fledged climate roadmap, and also some quite technical proposals on how to green its monetary policy portfolios and its collateral framework. Despite all of this institutional investment, the ECB essentially abandoned the vast majority of these green monetary policy plans in June of this year due to essentially political contestation that its plans were potentially a dangerous distraction from its primary mandate in the current time of high inflation. So the paper that I'm putting together with Daniela and Josh really tries to seek the lid on what is causing and shaping these kinds of rapid changes in financial policy. So the main focus of this presentation is going to be on this first point in this slide, exploring the systemic political economy factors, i.e. the institutional politics and the structural pressures that are shaping central bank policy choices, and why this means that we're failing to see the disciplining of private finance that we need to kind of manage the sort of ongoing flows of harmful finance that Gregor just outlined in his presentation, and the ways that this undermines the green transition more broadly. And we focus on central banks because they really play an outsized role as policymakers due to their enormous balance sheets, which are very much entangled within the infrastructures of private credit creation. And in our broader academic paper, the working paper version is out, and you can read that if you're interested. But in the second half of our paper, we go on to explore how we believe a central bank could evolve to more properly support transition policy. Unfortunately, I won't have time to go into that in today's presentation, but I will touch on it a little bit during the conclusion. So one of the main contributions of our work is to integrate the theoretical lenses of critical macro finance into the political economy of green central banking. And critical macro finance, through the work of my co-author, Daniela Gabor, and others, has really articulated the growing dominance of market-based finance in private credit creation. So, this is the creation of credit and money by actors beyond regulated banks through mechanisms such as repo markets, derivative markets, cross-border, cross-currency lending, and off-balance sheet securitization structures. And one of the kind of key systemic implications of market-based finance is that sovereign bonds in particular have taken on almost systemic importance for financial stability due to their role as collateral in these modes of credit creation. And what critical macro finance scholars have argued is that basically the importance of the dominance of market-based finance has really tested the limits of the institutional architecture of the past 40 years, which is that of this operationally independent inflation targeting central bank, essentially. And it's tested those limits because the systemic importance of these modes of private credit creation have structurally constrained the central bank in its policy choices to use its balance sheet in ways which preserve the investability of these markets that are very central to macro financial stability, and also actually to a certain extent to the transmission mechanisms of monetary policy. So what we do in our paper is we kind of build on these analytical insights to consider how the same sorts of structural pressures and institutional politics have shaped or constrained the evolution of the sorts of green financial policies that we've seen emerge over the past 4 years. And in particular, we articulate what we name a risk-based policy approach to greening finance, which has emerged as the kind of dominant policy mode adopted by major central banks, which has emerged from this macroeconomic status quo, which prioritizes monetary dominance. So that's another way of saying an independent inflation targeting central bank, and also fiscal conservatism. And as part of this institutional setup, central banks have been able to focus on climate change only from the quite narrow confines of their mandate, which is how climate change may materialize as risks that threaten price and financial stability. So under this policy mode, the decarbonisation formula becomes essentially private finance leads the green transition whilst the state assists. And as you can see in this table here, assistance can work through two pillars. On the one hand, you have what we call de-risking strategies, which is where policymakers such as central banks use their toolkits to correct price signals and to improve incentives for private finance to invest in green assets. And on the other hand, we have what we call market fixing strategies, which is about improving the quality of climate risk disclosures in order to enhance price discovery through disclosure frameworks such as the TCFD, which you might have heard of, the sustainable taxonomy and other taxonomies, and ESG frameworks. So here are just some examples of central bank de-risking interventions, which I won't go into too much detail now due to time. But what I will say is that overall, this policy approach is characterized by policy toolkits only really being used to adjust relative prices of green versus dirty finance through either through signaling effects or through demand effects through the use of the central bank balance sheet. What's notable is there's no explicit disciplining mechanism in these policy toolkits, which tries to penalise flows of finance that are going and continuing to support harmful activities which undermine the green transition. Instead, sectoral allocation decisions are basically left entirely to the discretion of the private sector, who are themselves kind of assumed to rationally assess and respond to climate risk information that's being disclosed. And, attempts to apply de-risking to monetary policy in particular are actually very interesting from a political economy perspective, because it directly requires challenging the logic of market neutrality, which is a fundamental pillar of monetary dominance. So market neutrality basically says that when a central bank invests in asset markets as part of its asset purchase portfolios, which could be in corporate bonds or other assets, it has to invest in a way which replicates exactly the market structure as it stands. It can't kind of take the sorts of decisions that might favour one sector over another. However, the problem with this is that it obviously replicates climate externalities which exist in the market already, right? So there's been lots of analysis done which shows how central bank monetary policy portfolios actually have an inbuilt carbon bias within them. So due to recognising this, the ECB is quite an interesting case study, because it recognised the carbon bias within its monetary policy toolkits, and it actually took a very different stance to other central banks such as the Bank of England, in recognising that market neutrality as a concept needed to be replaced in order to avoid replicating these kind of climate market failures, which this quote I put on the slide by Isabel Schnabel, who's a board member of the ECB, makes quite clear. And in July 2022, the ECB announced some actually very ambitious plans to, amongst other things, actively tilt their corporate bond holdings towards issuers with better climate performances, which was defined as having lower greenhouse gas emissions, more ambitious carbon reduction targets, and better climate-related disclosures. And what we argue in our paper is that not only is this language a really clear departure from market neutrality, actually marks something quite unprecedented from a notionally independent inflation targeting central bank, in that it implies a logic of discipline that has to be implemented to monitor the compliance of bond issuers, in order to punish the bad performers and reward the good performers, which represents, really quite a marked step beyond the central bank's usual territory of monitoring just bank balance sheets for financial stability purposes. Instead, here, what the ECB was proposing to do was to take a discretionary view on the climate performance of corporates beyond just banks. So this was really quite interesting from a political economy perspective. However, the institutional tensions of trying to kind of challenge market neutrality at a time of high inflation became quite apparent this year, and as I said earlier, became actually very politically contested. So after the Fed and the Bank of England announced plans for quantitative tightening and began to rapidly ramp up interest rates to control inflation, the ECB was kind of forced to fall in line, essentially. And there's another argument that the inflation argument kind of gave a bit more power to anti-climate lobbies that were already pressuring the ECB to not implement its green policies. So by June of this year, all of its kind of green monetary policy plans were essentially abandoned or U-turned, which demonstrates this kind of the institutional constraint of monetary dominance, what the kind of difficult politics that imposes on shaping central bank choices. And instead, what the ECB and other central banks have had to fall back on is this, what we term a weaker version of the risk-based approach, which relies on market fixing strategies. So just briefly, I've only got a couple of slides left. I'll try and whiz through them. Market fixing is a strategy which basically tries to improve information on climate risks to internalize them into market pricing, and therefore try and get corporate actors to change their capital allocation decisions as a result of that. And there's been lots written about how this theory of change is unlikely to rapidly decarbonize finance. First of all, as you can see from the chart on the right, it's not been materially effective in reducing harmful flows of finance since the Paris Agreement. And this is, considering that the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is kind of the main framework for this approach, has been in existence for 6 years now. We're still seeing flows of finance to fossil fuels increasing. And various authors have pointed out that, you know, these so-called climate risks are subject to radical uncertainty because this is unprecedented climatic change we're talking about. So they're not the same as kind of conventionally probabilistic financial risks that banks are used to dealing with. And therefore, this uncertainty surrounding the materiality of these risks might explain why some corporate actors are not acting on that information in their capital allocation decisions. You know, other authors have also pointed out that many ESG frameworks and risk disclosure initiatives have been developed by or in very close proximity to coalitions of private actors with vested interests, you know, which brings to light issues of systemic greenwashing. And finally, and this is a contribution in our own paper, that there's the fact that market fixing approaches have this enormous blind spot when it comes to the fact that a lot of credit creation nowadays occurs via this complex ecosystem of institutional capital, which must also be decarbonised. And this actually connects really nicely to the network analysis graph that Gregor summarised in his presentation. And this graph we have in our own paper also attempts to trace the alternative sources of credit and capital that can continue to finance carbon-intensive activities. So what this means in practice is that large investors like banks, for example, can be outwardly appearing to divest of their direct exposures to activities which are incompatible with the net zero targets. But they can still continue to indirectly finance these activities through their allocations to private equity, to hedge funds, to exchange-traded funds, and even more indirectly through their involvement in the repo market. And what's important is that these alternative actors are not subject to the same supervisory or regulatory requirements on risk disclosures or ESG frameworks. So it's creating essentially this regulatory arbitrage opportunity for private finance. And I think some of Gregor's work shows that quite nicely in terms of who's picking up and continuing to profit from these stranded assets. So this is my last slide. So just to summarize our argument, I guess, what we're saying is that at the current juncture, no major central bank wants to be seen as a climate policymaker. However, the risk-based approach which they're relying on to decarbonise finance is actually reaching its limits in its ability to effectively do so. So first of all, the structural demands of market-based finance and the contested institutional politics of monetary dominance, and especially in this time of inflation, these things together are constraining the actions of central banks to quite a narrow set of policy tools. And second, those same policy tools are actually conferring significant power to the private sector in determining the pace and the direction of the transition. And they're ignoring the risks of regulatory capture, greenwashing, and mechanisms of backdoor financing of fossil fuel activities via shadow banks. So given these limitations, we argue that actually using a central bank to decarbonise the economy requires precisely a climate policy-making central bank using, for example, more direct instruments such as credit policy to directly steer finance. But this ultimately implies the end of monetary dominance as a macro-financial institutional regime. And requires the deployment of the sorts of institutional coordination between fiscal policy, industrial policy, monetary policy, which doesn't exist in any major economy at the moment. And there are obviously larger political questions to be talked about there in terms of what's constraining movements towards that. So I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over time, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katie. Don't worry about having gone over. I know we give a very mean time limit, so that's all good. I won't be asking you a question just now, just so that we can move on to Daniel's presentation, but I do have a lot of questions for you. So maybe we can come back to that afterwards during the Q&A. Just one thing that stood out to me from your presentation is that I found it quite sobering, to be honest, to see after what Gregor had presented about sort of the vested fossil fuel interest in the stranded assets. And then now you presenting that places like the ECB are actually kind of going back a little bit on their more bolder statements that they made before. I found that quite sobering and also very interesting because we did have an event previously at Decarb, which was concerned only with sort of green monetary policy. And I think that event painted a much more helpful picture, but you kind of shed a critical lens on sort of what happened since. And I'm sure there might be some interested, I know actually there are some people in the audience today who are really interested in that. So maybe they can put some questions in the Q&A for you. I will now move to Daniel Mittler, our third and final presenter and panelist for today. I'm really excited that we have you with us here today, Daniel. Daniel Mittler is the managing director of Bürgerbewegung Finanzwende, where he leads the areas of campaigns and communications. And prior to joining Bürgerbewegung Finanzwende, Daniel was the political director of Greenpeace International for 11 years. And before that, he led the German arm of the European Climate Foundation. So as I was preparing, I became really excited for your contribution, because I was thinking, you were there when they made these decisions around 1.5 degrees. I mean, maybe you were not there in the room, but you were certainly there in the kind of political climate at the time, more on the environmental activism and lobbyism side. And I think you will hopefully be able to give a very interesting and different kind of perspective on perhaps why we're now looking back 10 years later, like, well, what has happened in these past 10 years. Right, so I will hand over to you, looking forward to your points that you'll be sharing with us, and then afterwards we'll go to the plenary discussion with everyone.
Thank you. And yeah, maybe I'll pick up on the theme of where people have been, and also on hope and lack of hope. Because one of the things that I've always enjoyed about working at a place like Greenpeace is that it believes in making change that looks impossible doable. And that is no surprise, because that's actually a quote from one of the founders who said that big change looks impossible when you start with it, and inevitable when you're done with it. And I think that's obviously what's happening in the green transition. On the technical side, on the technology side, I'm old enough to have already witnessed that change once. So I can remember being laughed at for even suggesting that the renewables energy levels in places like Germany would reach above 10%. And look where we are now, and look where we are in terms of that global transition that is, by this point, unstoppable. The big question is whether it's going to be fast enough for our climate and our ability to actually maintain the climate at a stable level. But that change is on its way, is by now inevitable. And I was there in Paris. I was also there in Copenhagen when things failed badly. And I remember the Exxon Mobil, don't quote me on the number, but I believe the Exxon Mobil share price went down by 8% the moment that the wires announced that the Paris Agreement deal was done. And that shows that, yeah, we need to set the regulatory frameworks right, and then finance will follow. But as Gregor showed, we still have a long, long way to go. And I now work for a small organization, Finanzwende, and we see our role in the specific transition contribution that we are making in looking at the structural problems that the finance sector is creating for the transition, and therefore contributing to making the finance sector finally becoming on board. There is a widespread confusion that the finance sector is already part of the solution, and I was part of that illusion happening in places like the foundation world, but also in environmental organizations, because I have indeed seen, and this is part of the inevitability of the energy transition, I have indeed also seen finance play a role in killing coal plants. That is true. That has happened because it's such a bad investment in so many places around the world these days. But that doesn't mean that the finance sector is a part of the solution, at least not the finance sector as we have it now. And Gregor, you were pointing to the IEA numbers, and I have to say, at some level, thrilled that the IEA is putting out these numbers now, because I remember as Greenpeace, we put out for many years a series of so-called energy revolution scenarios. And this also goes back to the hopeful side of the story. Even we underestimated the growth of solar in those predictions. But the point of those studies was that we used IEA numbers and their projections as to energy demands, etc., and showed that even if you assume those very conservative numbers, you can do it without fossil fuels, and all fossil fuels that it is, also whether abated or unabated. So it's actually exciting to see that the IEA is now there, that they are starting to move with their scenarios much closer to reality, because in reality we are seeing change, but also much closer to the scenarios that used to have to come from civil society. But again, we're definitely not there yet. And we, I think the two things that we sort of just have to point out is, in terms of the structural side of the financial system, is that as long as we have short-termism built into that system the way it is right now, we will not have it on the side of long-term transition. And Katie, you basically spoke to that in terms of state-led industrial policy, etc. And that's, of course, also the reason why in the last 3 years so much money moved into fossil fuels, because you could make quick money. And who is to blame an investor that wants to make money for as long as the system delivers exactly that? You do have to blame the people that are in addition greenwashing. And that's been also something that we looked at over the last couple of years. And it's been shocking to see that in 2022, according to the EU rules, green or so-called green bonds that have been on the German market have gotten significantly more dirty. And DWS, the Deutsche Bank daughter company that's been in the headlines also for greenwashing allegations and other things anyway. But in response, what have they done? They've bought an additional 850 million in fossil fuel assets in 2022. And that's because exactly what, as Gregor was describing, you can make a lot of quick money with that. And they basically decided as managers that they wanted to partake in that bonanza and to hell with their green claims. So that's one side, the short-termism, and as long as you can make money, you will see money flow into fossil fuels. The other side is the stability aspects. And this is where central banks are very interesting, because they are interested in stability. That's why they should be, and some of them are, worried about climate risk, because some in those institutions recognize the thing that, Katie, you were pointing out, that actually it could become unmanageable, and that could be a problem. But at the same time, we're seeing a financial system, and you all remember Credit Suisse and Silicon Valley Bank, etc., earlier this year, that is still built on instability. And Silicon Valley Bank was a big supporter for solar projects, I understand, and the transition wasn't significantly held up by that hiccup. But a financial system that isn't stable is obviously not a good fellow to have when you're in the business of transitioning and making big structural changes in the economy over the longer term. Because if you constantly worry that the next day something new wobble is going to happen, and you're going to have to find yourself a new bank or a new way of financing your activities, you're not going to be in the mindset that we need for the long-term transition. But ultimately, the answer to the question of who's holding us back and why is it not happening is power. And you've both, Gregor and Katie, spoken to that in different ways as well. Our look at this as Finanzwende is very clearly that we need to tackle the power of the finance lobby. And we looked at the German Bundestag listings of lobby activities that are relatively new. So only for almost 2 years now do companies even have to declare these things in Germany. And after a year, we looked at that, and coming from the environmental movement initially, I expected, to be honest, that the car industry, the chemical industry, or maybe pharmaceuticals would be top. But if you look at the top 100 lobbyists in that database, you find that actually the biggest lobby is the finance lobby. And one of the key things that is standing in the way of the transition is that that is the case, but is not something that is getting as much political and public attention as other lobbies, including the fossil fuel lobby itself. And very often you can see this. We've done a study. Unfortunately, that one is only available in German. But you can see this if you look at the EU taxonomy conversations and any other conversation that should and could have taken us much further along the road of the transition. If you look at it, you will always find that the finance lobby was key to watering down the changes we need and was heavily involved, also especially at the early level of policy development, where impact can most often be made most quietly, but also most effectively. So our issue here is one about power. It's about shining the light on the finance lobby, and it's making sure that those who do stand in the way are actually named, and that there is not a naive belief that because some assets like coal are increasingly bad business, that somehow finance magically will move in the direction of the transition. So ultimately, we need to tackle the power of the lobby industry, not just specifically of fossil fuels, but also of the finance lobby that is often the enabler. And we need to set the rules right so that actually the short-term money that is currently still, in a way, understandably moving in the wrong direction is finally moved in the right direction. But the current system is not going to work for that, and we need very deep structural changes in the financial system to achieve that. And I would just point to one little report we've done. It's called The Limits of Sustainable Finance. That looks in much more detail than I could do it in these few minutes into these structural issues in the financial sector. And I'm going to share it with the presenters, and maybe we can share it in the question and answer place as well. So thank you, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Daniel. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your thoughts and reflections. And I'm really glad that you brought up two things that I was hoping would come up today. One of them is power, and the other one is short-termism. So you just called it by its name. And I would actually like to ask you a question about both of these with an actor that you've not brought into the picture just yet. So how about the government? Because obviously governments also run on, at least say in democratic states, right, where you need to be re-elected, they also run on a short-term basis, and places in which a lot of these power structures play out. So I guess my question for you is, how do you campaign for these things in a political climate where those in power are not in favor of this transition to take place?
That is a very good question, and if we had the answer really figured out, I guess we wouldn't be sitting here complaining that power is still not on our side, but on the other. Having said that, it's not impossible to make progress, and I've always believed that campaigning ultimately is about exactly that mix of the demanding the seemingly impossible and getting the small steps that eventually will make the seemingly impossible inevitable actually done. And so I would not dismiss some of the positive changes that have been made. To be honest, over the last 12 months or so, most of these have not been in the green transition space for the specific things Finanzwende has campaigned on. But we have made specific changes that you could argue are to some degree structural. One I would point to is that until recently, and this will sound insane to people not based in Germany, but until recently you could, for example, buy property in Germany only with cash. The mafia loved this. Not many sensible people love this, but this is now finally illegal even in Germany. And this is also an issue that indirectly has something to do with the transition, because the other element that I didn't mention yet in the finance system is that, of course, there is a lot of gray market stuff going on. And as Greenpeace, I experienced that over and over again. You would, for example, in Indonesia, you would campaign against a fossil fuel project. You would get the private banks worried and potentially pull out. And then some corruption or gray market actor would step in, and the project would still go ahead, and you would not be able to stop it. So it's not easy, but I do honestly believe that we can make those changes. And the truth is, though, that on the sort of structural side of the sustainability issue, it's too slow, and on the financial regulation side specifically, it's also depressingly slow. And as Katie was describing, in some cases also you make steps forward, and then you have to watch as they are moving backwards again.
Yeah, thank you so much for these reflections. I think now is a good time to go into the general discussion. We still have 55 people in the room. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. So I think now we'll get all the panelists together. Please, if you have a question, put it in the chat and make sure to tag the person that is directed at. And then just to you panelists, if someone else gets asked a question but you would like to chip in, please do so. This should be a conversation between all of us. I will start with Katie, because we've not had time before to go more into detail. There have been a few questions addressed at you, but I will start with this one. It's very broad, so you can pick what how you want to focus it. Someone asked what you think are the pros and cons of repoliticizing central banks when it comes to climate.
Yeah, fantastic question. This is a question I'd like to see much more in the public debate on central banking, rather than the kind of blind adherence or blind assumption that an independent central bank is automatically the best institutional architecture for this policymaker. I mean, look, my view is that central banks are already political actors, right? And their policy choices have huge political repercussions, on distribution being one obvious repercussion. Post great financial crisis, policy choices have made this abundantly clear. You know, the use of QE and other policy tools has contributed to asset price inflation and contributed to the growth of wealth inequality that we've seen over that time period. More recently, another recent political repercussion of central bank policy choices is the impacts that rate hikes are having on financing conditions for green innovating sectors, essentially. So there's kind of emerging anecdotal evidence that various green sectors are really struggling to finance themselves. So one example is offshore wind in the UK actually failed they had a contract with difference auction very recently that completely failed because one of the factors leading to that was the huge cost in financing for these actors due to rate hikes. And that's an effect that we're not seeing, obviously, on the carbon intensive side. So this is a political choice which has had political repercussions, and yet we still persist in this myth that the central bank is somehow an apolitical actor. And I think that's really something that needs to be challenged. But, you know, if I was to think about, okay, what could be the cons of repoliticizing a central bank? I think governance is a clear question here. I mean, in our paper, or in the new version, which will hopefully be coming out soon somewhere on the internet, we go back to look at the historical implementation of credit guidance regimes in the 20th century in central banks in France and the UK. There's plenty of examples of central banks using these types of more overt policies to take political decisions, essentially, in how they steer finance to penalise some sectors and to favour other sectors. And whilst those policies were, for the most part, very successful in achieving their aims, which were to kind of promote export industries and to reindustrialize post-war Europe, rebuild post-war Europe, there were also, has been been written about, some abuses of power in there and some governance problems, which by today's standards probably wouldn't hold. So, you know, there are questions there over technocracy and governance, which I think are very important to unpack in order to kind of address that question. But yeah, thank you for whoever answered that, because I think it's a fantastic one.
Yes, thank you. And I'm really glad we could revisit this question of like, are the central banks really neutral? Because I would agree with you. Certainly the way that they teach it at SOAS is a bit of I would also be more on board with how you see it than perhaps the Econ 101 textbook description. I have two questions now. One is for Gregor and one is for Daniel. I will just say them both and then you can decide who goes first. So Daniel is asked, what would you like to see ideally against lobbying from sort of the bad actors who come to lobby the government in favor of promoting dirty investments? So, for example, higher salaries for politicians or more transparent lobby meetings. And then for Gregor, someone asked whether you could dive deeper in how these stranded assets can be used for climate action. So have you thought about what you would like to see as an action now that you've identified where the problem lies when it comes to stranded assets?
Go for it, Gregor. You haven't.
All right, let me go first and let me be a bit cheeky and connect that with another question I see in the Q&A that asks whether the only real solution isn't to change expectations of companies. And so I think the discussion about stranded assets is quite abstract, because if all goes well, there aren't any stranded assets, right? So we're dealing here in hypothetical futures, in expectations about future scenarios. And how to use this would be to try and avoid ending up in these scenarios. And that has a lot to do with expectations, because we have a temporal problem, really. Financial decisions and real resources have to be committed today, with expectations about, you know, longer term future developments. And, you know, Daniel mentioned earlier, well, now people go into fossil fuels because they want to make a quick buck. And that's true. I mean, for some actors, they are very shrewd and skillful at moving in and out of sectors, right? And they're taking some profits with them, but they're also longer term investors. And I'd say they're somewhat correlated with, you know, what maybe the majority of us are doing when they're participating in financial markets, notably sort of through capital market-based pensions that need returns not just today and tomorrow, but for decades to come. And so, so influence and expectations, I think, is key, and that can be done, I guess, through policy, of course. And I think a lot of economists like carbon prices, with clear pathways for how these change. When you read the justifications for these, not only will they say they are efficient allocatively, but also that they create policy certainty and investment certainty. But I would say that's actually true of any policy that you do. If you can make it credible that this is going to happen over the long future, that helps investors change their expectations. And that is, of course, very hard, as we currently see in Germany, for instance, with a huge uncertainty about whether certain climate funds can actually be used, because the way they have been financed has been found to be against the law in Germany, in fact, against the constitution. So that's difficult. But a more softer aspect of this is, I think, that narratives and visions of the future matter. And Daniel mentioned how the IEA has changed its views of the future. And I really agree. I think the IEA has really become kind of I'd say quite a leader in trying to come up with useful scenarios that depict what's really going on and what could be possible over the last several years already. And so that's great, I think. So narratives, including about stranded assets, hopefully stimulate people's thinking about the future. And they are powerful. If you have a narrative that we will definitely need fossil fuels a lot and in increasing amounts over the next decades, whatever that may mean for the climate, and therefore I think indirectly also for the actual demand for fossil fuels, depending on climate impacts, that might move people to commit money today. So yeah, I think in that sense, the debate about stranded assets as a hypothetical future is particularly relevant to these discussions and actions today.
So let me start with the lobbying point. And it again goes to the theme of we don't get the structural changes we need immediately, but we can make some of the incremental steps that eventually, hopefully, will get to the structural changes. And so, yes, transparency regulation and lobbying regulation is absolutely a key part of the answer. And already the Bundestag sort of database that now exists that I mentioned is a step in the right direction, because it has actually made it much more possible to kind of really say, this is how much they do, and no wonder they get their way if they can intervene with that much money and that early on. But that is not enough. But you can make those small changes, because, for example, the finance sector in Germany, but also elsewhere, is very often using lobby agencies. So they're not actually, especially American banks, etc. They're not lobbying themselves in Berlin, but they're paying some agency to do it. And right now, that's still invisible. But we've just won the change in the lobby transparency law a few weeks ago, that from in the future, they will have to reveal who they work for and for how much money they are working for this particular cause and on what regulation. And that will be very interesting data to look at, because it will drag a whole part of policy influencing into the open that has been very deliberately kept out of the open in the past. And so, yes, those kind of regulations are key. But again, I'll also take on a bit more of the other questions that are in the chat. But there's also no doubt in my mind that we will just not be able to do it without proper regulation of all sorts of sectors. So lobby transparency alone is not going to do it. We clearly do need certain things like coal power simply to be outlawed. New fossil fuel developments should not be legal anywhere, but certainly not in the industrialized north and places like Germany. So there is a clear regulatory agenda that we need to also just be clear on, because I think, Katie, you also said it, that right now we're in a situation where a lot of things are getting a little bit greener, but especially the bad things are not actually being gotten rid of. And so as long as that's the case, we're not going to get anywhere in terms of our climate goals. And there's a German saying that things all get better, but nothing turns out well. And that's sometimes how I see the sustainable finance conversation, because everybody, especially the private actors, but also the ECB and so on, are always going on about how they're better than in the past. And some of it is true. But the reality, as you said, Katie, is that we're still seeing more money since the Paris Agreement going into fossil fuels than ever before. That's just insane. And so, I think we need a mix of regulatory approaches. And I think the big discussion that we're not going to have the time to have tonight, but that we all should be having with our communities and our in our politics, is how the heck we get there. Because right now, we're making the steps backwards rather than forwards, as both of you have also alluded to.
Okay, thank you. I'm circling back to Katie now with a question which is quite technical. So I do hope that I understand it correctly from the person asking the question. So someone asked about your risk-based policy approach in your presentation, and whether that comes from Brown and Gabor's work on the big green state. And so the question is the risk-based policy approach a associated with the weak/robust de-risking state and allocative approach in Brown and Gebor's paper on the big green state. So maybe you can just say 1 or 2 lines on that. And then I would like to tag on to this with a question that I had personally about whether you're looking at all at central banks in other parts of the world. Because I'm not an expert on central banks, but as far as I know, in more global south countries, sometimes they have different goals rather than only inflation targets. Is more linked to exchange rates or other development goals. So I'm just wondering whether there's other stuff happening there when it comes to climate.
Yeah, I can take those. So in answer to the first question, yes, it is kind of building on Ben Brown and Daniela's paper they released this year. We wrote our papers concurrently together, so there was kind of communication going on between us, and obviously Daniela's co-author on both of them. I guess where our paper builds on Brown and Gebor is that we kind of consider the institutional politics of what's kind of shaping these different approaches that they articulate. So why are we so structurally challenged in confronting, either weak de-risking or robust de-risking? And concurrently, what are these kind of institutional challenges that are preventing us from moving towards the big green state, as they put it? So that's kind of how we're building on their work there. And in terms of thinking about central banks in other parts of the world, this is a really important point. In our paper, we only really consider major central banks in Western economies, which is a very kind of one-sided view, because there are lots of central banks out there in the global south that actually face a really different set of structural pressures, basically to do with their subordinated financial position in kind of 21st century globalized financialization. So, for example, one of those external pressures is the need to constantly use their balance sheets and use their policy space to manage the exchange rate in order to mitigate their external vulnerability. And that structural pressure actually prevents these economies from investing in their own climate adaptation and mitigation strategies, right? So this is a systemic structural injustice that has to be addressed. So we don't consider that in our paper. However, there's been some great work done by Simon Dickow and my co-author Joshua Collins. They reviewed a number of green central banking, green financial policies taken by central banks in various emerging and developing economies, where they do actually have a wider remit to coordinate more with central governments in supporting priority sectors. And it's interesting to note that whereas a lot of the narrative tends to praise Mark Carney for kicking off the kind of green central banking scene, as it were, in actual fact, there's many examples of central banks prioritizing greening financial policy in the decades before Carney even began talking about it. So I highly recommend their paper for looking a bit more about that.
Amazing, thank you. I have spotted a question in the chat from Tobias Bergman, our colleague who is also behind the scenes in the tech room. So Tobias, I will take your question. It's directed to anyone that wants to answer. And he asks, the IEA and central banks are starting to change and are thinking about green policies and green futures. What are some of the key players that are still missing, who you would like to come around for us to see the greatest impact? So I think we can just play wishful thinking for a moment. Who would you like to come on board for the green transition, so it's no longer held up based on your work?
I can start first. Just to name one actor, I think financial securities regulators are really key actors who aren't doing a huge amount at the moment. They would be quite important in terms of trying to manage the shadow banking problem, which I outlined in my presentation. So how do you decarbonize the use of dirty fossil assets as collateral, which is kind of fueling this kind of backdoor credit creation? Those would be the key actors to get on board there.
I can build on that. So financial regulators in Germany, the BaFin, they have gotten better in the wake of Wirecard. Wasn't very hard to get better in that context in certain areas, but they're clearly still asleep as when it comes to climate risk and actually doing anything about it. And so those kind of bodies just need to get some teeth, and actually some of them have, we can argue about whether they're good enough, but you know, they have some sort of rule book now as to what banks, for example, should do, but it's just not happening. And in terms of their ability to go in and actually test and corral and kind of ask tough questions, they're not using that power right now at all, as far as we can see, and they should.
Well, I would just like to say that, you know, for any fossil fuel phase down and phase out, you need a dramatic upscale of alternatives. You know, the world is using more energy going forward. I mean, I don't think that you know, in the near future, a lot of countries around the world are trying very hard to grow their economies and grow people's living standards, and that's going to increase energy demand. So I think any narrative about not committing this and that investment in fossil fuels really needs a credible alternative on the providing alternative energy supply. And, you know, that's really an all hands on deck approach. And Katie and Daniel pointed to some important players there. I just want to emphasize that point here.
Yeah, I think those were really interesting points, and I would actually like to build on that question, because someone in the Q&A section actually mentioned COP. Obviously, COP is right around the corner. Daniel is is smiling at this. You've probably seen them all. My question that I would just like to ask is, ideally, what would you like to see to come out of this COP? So we just spoke about kind of which actors would be needed to stop the holdup in the green transition. Now, I guess let's move on to a wishful thinking of what kind of decisions you would actually like to see be put in place in the international arena. And yeah, it doesn't have to be specific to COP. I'm using that more as a hook because I think it's right in front of us right now, and it's going to be in Dubai as well, which obviously has an economy really entrenched in fossil fuels. So looking forward to your thoughts on that, and that will be also the final round of comments. So if there's anything that you want to add, now would be a good time before we close out the webinar.
Well, I could quickly go first this time. You know, you're speaking about wishful thinking. Okay, so here are two wishes. One is a lot more investable money in many parts of the world into low carbon technologies that is adequate for the kind of risk return time horizon profiles that are associated with these investments, and for which there's not enough there right now. And I think specifically in global north countries, you know, better coordination around integrating what is already quite a substantial amount of renewable energy supply, including with storage options, and thus, you know, really replacing, at least in the power sector, and there's a lot of electrification, so the power sector is important. So integrating all of that with the demand for electricity in that part, because that involves infrastructure investments in grids and grid modernization. I think that's currently a pretty important stumbling block there, even though many other things actually seem to be going in the right direction. I don't think that COP necessarily needs to do anything on that. That's more a domestic issue, but I think it's a pressing one.
I can go next. I guess if we're really thinking, you know, what are the gold standard demands that we should be aiming towards? I think the first one would be a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, where you actually have binding commitments to no longer develop remaining fossil fuel reserves. And concurrent to that, how do we manage the huge profits of remaining fossil fuels that are being developed? How can that be reoriented to kind of finance the transition rather than lining the pockets of those who are already very wealthy? So that would be number one. The second one would be a much better discussion than that we've had in previous and recent years on redistributive mechanisms to finance climate adaptation in the global south, because most of a lot of very harmful climate impacts are already locked in, and the structural injustices that I kind of alluded to earlier are preventing these many economies from investing in adaptation to protect their people. So yeah, I think there needs to be much more ambition in redistribution as well.
I can get behind that. I was saying, stating the truth in the COP decision that fossil fuels need to end. Gregor, your point is, and I think that is sort of on the agenda as potentially a renewables targets of some sort that could be a sort of signal at least. And yeah, adaptation is one side, and there's things that we can no longer adapt to. So a massive step forward on the loss and damage fund would definitely also help if that came out of COP. I'm not convinced it will, but let's end on the positive note. So I think the question earlier about which actors do we need to get involved, I mean, ultimately the answer always is us, right? Citizens. So if we're talking about power, it can be seem very abstract. If we're talking about structures, they are real, and we need to figure them out, because right now trade rules, finance rules, etc., are kind of hardwiring our global economy to still go in the wrong direction, even as we have global agreements that are at least pointing us towards the right direction. And so these things are really important, but unless we get an active citizenry, that's why we call ourselves Bürgerbewegung, Finanzwende. So we're a citizens movement, because we want to make finance not this abstract thing and climate not this abstract thing, but we want to get citizens involved in actually delivering the change. And some of it will be one step at a time, and some of it will go for the structural changes immediately. We'll need both, and we'll need it fast, unfortunately, if we're not going to face the uncontrollable scenario that we've also seen in your presentation.
Thank you so much. I really want to give a big round of virtual applause to all the three of you, and want to thank you so much for the time that you've spent with us today and all the work that you've put in your presentation. I really also enjoyed the discussion, because I felt like you all did such a good job at answering the questions, like really on point. So I wish we had more time to go on. But I just want to summarize sort of three key takeaways that I have from today. So first is Gregor's point that the fossil fuel economy is deeply linked with global inequalities, and we have to decide now what future we want. Then Katie, who reminded us how important it is to hold big institutions accountable to their climate pledges, and to question some of the narratives that we are told around central banks. And finally, Daniel, who reminded us that the finance sector can be both part of the problem and part of the solution, and that we should never lose hope when it comes to making small changes towards achieving big visions. I would also like to just take this final moment to thank my colleagues at the Decarb Future Economy Forum and at Hertie School. Webinars like these are really a team effort, and there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to make it a very smooth process. So I would like to pass a special thanks, especially to Johanna Kupa, who was organizing this session with me. She's one of the strategic minds between sort of putting together the speakers and setting the focus of today. Also to Tobias Merkmann, Bernardo Bock, and Jenny Girard, who have been managing the Zoom behind the scenes. And then to Niels, Simon, Alex, Florian, Henny, Anna, Swetha, Bashak, and everyone else at Decarb who makes these events possible. We are a student-run organization. None of us get any money for what we do. We are volunteer-run. So if you are interested to join, then please do contact us through one of our channels, and we're always glad to bring new members and perspectives on board. And Finally, I would like to alert you all to our next upcoming event. I think today was such a good segue into the new event because it will be about climate finance with a special focus on how to achieve a just climate finance and for the global south. So the topic will be how to keep up the $100 billion per year pledge that the international community has made. And as far as I'm aware, is currently being planned for the 18th of January. And those who attended today will automatically receive an invite once the registration page for that is open. So keep your ears and eyes peeled. Thank you so much. I hope to see many of you again in the future at Decarb events, and have a good evening. Hi, Bernardo. I think we're good. Can you end the recording, please?